Any idea that the UGB was never to be modified is simply not true. I'm Rob Burgess from Quantify Strategic Insights. I've been working in planning and property for 30 years in Melbourne. So the UGB was formally introduced into the Victorian planning system in 2002, and it was part of the metropolitan policy at that point, which was called Melbourne 2030. The UGB effectively formalised the green wedges which had been introduced into the Melbourne planning system in the early 70s. So the concept of the UGB was to manage growth, in particular residential development, keep that from effectively sprawling as Melbourne grew over the ensuing decades. With the UGB was also an emphasis on densification of existing areas. So the focus has been about restricting outward development and building Melbourne up at the same time. So multiple examples of where outward urban development had been controlled, both in North America and to a degree within the UK, where obviously the Green Belt concept in effect put limits around areas and the extent to which they could grow. Multiple examples, or numerous examples in North America, included both Vancouver, in Canada of course, and very well-known examples from Oregon, in particular Portland, whereby they've had urban growth boundaries now for a significant period of time. Within the Oregon urban growth boundary system, there has been an allowance over the years to adjust and expand their UGB as need be. And so really very much a tool for growth and management on an as-needs basis. Now, like many locations, it's experiencing significant demand pressure for housing. Some months ago, the Oregon legislature voted to make changes to allow those boundaries to be altered in a much more straightforward and simple manner than what they previously had to. So again, a reflection of now the pressure that they're facing from a housing market perspective, and recognition that they need to actually be far more flexible with their boundaries if they're to accommodate the number of houses that they're expected to. So a really interesting example, I guess, being set now by Oregon, who have very much been the poster child for urban containment, whereby in comparison to Melbourne now, unlike Oregon, which is introducing the level of flexibility to accommodate the growth, our state government has recently announced that they are committed to making our urban growth boundary permanent. Introduced, as I said, back in the early 2000s, there had been provision for a number of years to expand and adjust our urban growth boundary, again on an as-needs basis according to certain criteria, obviously including population growth and the need for housing. Recent commitment to now make our urban growth boundary permanent obviously impacts our ability to change and accommodate forecast population growth. This is now obviously having a spillover effect in terms of our ability to accommodate this growth, and we continue to see pressure on our housing market, upward prices in the growth areas, and some significant questions about Melbourne's ability to accommodate the population which is forecast. The process to change Melbourne's urban growth boundary required effectively an Act of Parliament whereby it had to go through both houses to support that change. So it's been a deeply political exercise to begin with, now exacerbated by the fact that we've got the state government that has said, despite the level of population and the worsening housing situation that we face, that the UGB is to permanent. So clearly there's an attachment now to the compact city objective, which was what underpinned Melbourne 2030 some 20 years ago. Now, arguably that's coming at significant and worsening costs as the weeks and months pass in terms of where our housing market is at. So we've had a process by which that shift can happen. The commitment is now to make it permanent, and the densification in concert to continue to grow. Melbourne's growth areas have been a significant location in where young people have bought their first home. And as we look forward over the next few years, the age cohort which will grow greater than any other in Melbourne is the 35 to 44-year-old age cohort. That's significant because there are two major events which typically define that age cohort. One is formation of a family, and the other one is purchasing their first home. So the fact that we've got this now groundswell of people in that age cohort, many of whom in the past will buy in the growth areas, will effectively be priced out of being able to do that. The other point worth mentioning in relation to that is of that cohort, 40% of them are born overseas. Overseas migrants, many of whom come to Australia and seek to buy a family dwelling at an affordable price, will also be priced out of this market. We're now approaching that point where we're simply not going to be able to accommodate the housing preferences and needs of a growing number of people. When the UGB was first introduced back in 2002, it was on a premise that there would be an additional 1 million people in Melbourne by 2030. That was in fact achieved 15 years earlier than what it was first planned for. So we can see that the supply and demand dynamics impacting the growth areas have fundamentally changed. And now for many years, we have effectively been behind the 8 ball in being able to continue to accommodate that growth with affordable housing options. That population growth, obviously fueled by immigration, isn't going away and will continue to drive Melbourne towards a population of 8 million by 2050. In doing so, unless we have the land and the housing options at an affordable price to accommodate these people, we will continue to experience worsening housing and associated issues and impacts on Melbourne. It's often assumed that the urban boundary can remain, and the benefits which spin from that are worth retaining where it is. But the supply and demand dynamics which are affecting the Melbourne housing market are such that the UGB is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And any assumption that greenfield land and the projects which are developed on it are equal are simply flawed. The application of a hard and fast boundary as a means to manage future growth is a simplistic and blunt tool. The ability now and the understanding that we have about delivering quality projects, being able to assess genuinely valuable land or not, should warrant a more sophisticated approach rather than simply a hard and fast boundary which doesn't indicate necessarily any significant value.